What's going on, fellas? Today I wanted to make a video for you guys discussing how to prepare for a heavy training session. If you are familiar with maybe me or Max talking about our training, we will often say, oh, I prepped very well for this session. Oh, I did not prep well for this session, as kind of a indicator of, okay, well, how well did we do with our outside the gym variables leading up to this training session? And that's one of our leading indicators for whether that session should go well or it should go poorly, right? So if prep goes well, the session goes badly, that is a surprise. That often we might need to look to the inside the program variables. If we know the outside the program prep was nailed, then maybe what we need to look at is in the program, or vice versa, right? If the prep was bad and we know it was bad, the performance is bad, more than likely nothing about the program itself needs to be changed. We need to pay closer attention to the prep itself. And a couple of people have asked me, and I realized it wasn't innately implied, what does a good preparation for a heavy or a priority or an important training session look like? So going through basically the basics of what we're going to be looking at. The first one we're going to be looking at is hydrating well, right? I've screened this from the rooftops for ages now, but it's not just drinking water the morning of the session, right? Or the day of the session. Usually what I tell people is for about the 24 hours leading up to the session, we want to be paying attention to getting a good level of water intake. A lot of evidence-based guys will tell you, hey, just drink when you're thirsty. There's no real evidence for any quantity of water that we might need to intake. Your body has hormonal pathways to signal when you're dehydrated. I've always pushed back on that a little bit because that's reactionary, right? By the time you release some, thirst-related hormonal signals, by that time we are some level of dehydrated. If we are an athlete and we're trying to maximize our athletic performance, we probably want to be preemptive and never enter that state by kind of monitoring and making a consistent water intake. So 24 hours before the session, making sure we're drinking enough water, but also making sure that if we're not good about drinking our water the rest of the time, our water intake has come up a little bit, making sure that we're intaking proportional amounts of sodium and potassium through the day. So salting all of our meals to taste, making sure we have a notable source of potassium with each meal, because hydration status is dependent on what you can retain, right? So electrolyte intake needs to be proportionate. So making sure we're getting a lot of salt, making sure we're eating our fruit, getting a lot of potassium from whatever source you prefer, whether that be potatoes, whether that be fruit, whether that be yogurt, whether that be salmon, right? We have a lot of options. Making sure we get both of those things in copious amounts alongside carbohydrates to make sure we retain the water. And the last thing I wanted to touch on here is be aware that there is too much of a good thing, right? Drinking too much water, at that point we're just diluting our limited amount of electrolytes in our system, and we're actually negatively impacting our hydration status. So that's an easy one to avoid. Looking at food, right? A lot of the time, especially in a powerlifting meet, you'll see guys will show up with a bunch of candy. They've got all these ideas about carb loading of, oh, I'm going to eat X, Y, or Z, and I'm going to get this huge super compensation. The amount we're going to get from varying our food is going to be a bit, assuming we were in a caloric surplus in the lead up to this. Increasing the size of the caloric surplus isn't going to be this huge, powerful variable. You're not going to get some giant slingshotting effect by carbing up. And more often than not, the people that do that at the powerlifting meet end up doing worse because they're eating foods that they don't often eat. They get some level of gastric distress. They're having to run to the bathroom, shitting out all their electrolytes, shitting out all their water because they're eating like a moron at the contest. So what we're going to look at is eating the same foods we normally eat that we know how we respond to, and then just tweaking the quantities of them. You can try for you, especially if you're in a deficit or at maintenance, you might find that either eating a higher carb night before or a higher carb morning of, depending what time you train, depending on your personal preferences, you might find that might significantly boost your performance. You might find it might significantly improve your performance on the bench, maybe the squat, but not the deadlift, because we don't want to be bloated as it might throw off our positioning, right? So it's just something to trial is, hey, maybe we can include a higher carbohydrate, higher calorie day. I would generally recommend doing the increase in calories via carbohydrates, just because a big increase in fat or protein intake can probably just slow down your digestion and make you not feel too great. So maybe ramping up our carbs a bit, but again, avoiding too much of a good thing, right? Just because bumping your carbs 100 grams the night before yields good results doesn't mean bumping your carbs 500 grams is going to make you any better off. No, you might just be uncomfortable and bloated. The next one we're going to touch on is, this one's kind of hit or miss. You can try it for yourself. Max has always had a large amount of success with it. I have had a large amount of success with it. And it's just doing the relevant mobility work the night before, right? So if you're going to be squatting the next day, hanging out in the bottom of a third world squat, stretching out the ankles, stretching out the hips. If we're going to be benching, doing a little bit of T-spine mobility, so on and so forth. Just anything that you find is a deficiency for you. If you've got great ankle mobility, probably don't bother to stretch your ankles the night before. If you find that your hip mobility is poor, kind of hitting what we need to, no more, no less. The mechanism for which this might help is debatable, right? It could just be kind of a mindfulness practice. It could be just keeping your mind on the task of the next day. Most of the benefits of stretching are short-lasted. They're, who knows how long, but they're transient improvements in mobility that aren't probably going to be lasting to the next day, but exposing your body to those positions relevant to the lift might have proprioceptive benefits, so your form might be a little bit better the next day. But whatever we decide the mechanism of action is, whether it's more mental, whether it's more physical, whether it's more technique based, whatever it might be, a lot of people find that to be beneficial. And while it's not necessarily scientifically supported, we also can throw foam rolling in here, right? As long as we're not making the claim that we're breaking up any scar tissue, which isn't happening, right? Scar tissue is tougher, more durable than skin is. So if you were breaking up scar tissue, you'd be bleeding. We know that's not what's happening. We're not releasing fascia more than likely. If we just throw all those mechanisms of action out the window and say, hey, I feel nice when I roll out my quads, roll out your quads the night before. It's not going to have any negative effects because, again, foam rolling yields these transient effects that don't last for very long. You can say that's a bad thing. Oh, we're not breaking up scar tissue. Or you can say it's a good thing. Well, hey, if I do it the night before, it's certainly going to have absolutely no meaningful impact on my ability to lift the next day, and I feel better. Cool, problem solved. Moving on to the next one, and this is a big one that I can't convince people to do. People will sign off. They're like, yeah, that sounds like it works. I care about lifting, but then won't bother to do it. And that's visualization, right? Visualization can have a very powerful impact on how you perform. It could help with learning motor skills, so motor skill acquisition. It could help with force output, whatever it might be, but running through the lift you're going to do the next day, doing it perfectly, it moving easily, the pristine technique that you're looking for, how that's going to look, how that's going to feel. So imagining the feelings associated with the lift and how that might look externally can both be valid strategies. You can mess around with when you do it. It could be good when you're going to bed the night before. It can be while you're warming up for the lift itself. It could be while you're doing your cardio to get warm, right? You can put this a whole lot of places, whatever makes you feel the most prepared. And visualization, unlike maybe foam rolling or stretching, is one of the things that we do have a reasonable amount of scientific data to support that this is a very good practice to maximize our performance. The next thing we're going to touch on is don't overrest. A lot of guys will be like, oh, I'm fatigued, got a big session tomorrow, I'm going to be a total couch potato, and all of my resources are going to recovery, right? But we do know, again, scientifically, more than likely, active recovery is more effective than passive recovery. So what do we want to do? We want to make sure that we're taking the same number of steps we normally take. If we're kind of sedentary and we rely on the gym for getting our daily activity, then on the rest days, maybe even doing a little bit more, going on an extra walk or two, maybe taking a few more steps, check the step counter on your phone, and making sure that, hey, if we're kind of overly reliant on the gym for being the bulk of our physical activity every day, we don't want to be devoid of physical activity on our rest days. Do something that's restorative, like going on a walk, and this can make a big difference. A lot of the time you'll notice that if you stay in bed all day, you don't move at all, the next day when you should feel really recovered, you feel stiff. And had you moved around a bit, you would have felt better. And again, it's too much of a good thing is a bad thing, right? Because then you're not going to be recovering. If you do a recovery workout and you're obsessed with progressively overloading your recovery workout, then it's going to become a regular training session, and it's going to be too much, and you're going to be worse off than had you done less. And too little, again, you feel bad and you under recover. So trying to find a good middle ground there. And then the last one we're going to touch on is rituals and superstitions, right? This one's a little bit odd, but I feel the need to bring it in here. So preparation, kind of like we talked about, is just as much mentally improving how ready you are for the session and how optimistic you are about it as it is for loading up on some extra carbohydrates, making sure our hydration status is good. Both of these things are very important. Don't hit me with the usual YouTube, if you had to pick one or the other. You don't have to pick one or the other. Do them both. They're both fucking important, right? So, we're going to make sure that we're mentally prepared, right? And small superstitions, little things. You're like, hey, when I take a warm bath, make sure you drink water if you take a warm bath, right? It might stimulate blood flow well to maybe help with recovery, but it's also going to dehydrate you, so you need to make sure you're intaking water and salt. But whatever it might be, if I do my mobility, if I do X, Y, or Z, if I go to bed a little bit earlier, whatever it might be, also sleep should be included in this prep. Forgot to make a slide for that, but pretend that's in here. But if you have little superstitions, you're like, hey, if I eat this meal that doesn't upset my stomach the night before, I tend to feel stronger the next day. If you say, oh, if I eat steak the night before, I feel like a house when I wake up. eat the fucking steak. Doesn't matter if you're correct or incorrect, because as I said in this last bullet point, the placebo effect is still in effect, right? In a perfect world, right? It's like, yeah, okay, even if this guy was tricked into performing better, he still performed better. In a perfect world, we explain kind of all of these variables. The athlete understands things, and they can get that benefit that they're deriving from the placebo effect just by having a good understanding of all of what's going on. But the placebo effect's still in effect. If you really just feel this food makes you stronger, eat the fucking food. If you think having 2 bananas before a big bench session instead of 1 just makes you fucking powerful, like I do, then eat 2 bananas, right? That's all the ones I wanted to touch on. Thank you guys for watching my video. Hopefully, if this went well, you will see a little frame in frame of the slides. I stole this from Mike Israetel and Bromley, and I think it's a good format, so I'm stealing it, just like Bromley did from, he said it. I'm not accusing him. But enjoy my video. If you enjoyed my video, leave a like. Thank you guys for watching.